Hey everybody, in this short video I'm going to give you a quick overview of how to do a systematic speaker shootout like the one I posted in my recent video where I compared 7 different speakers with a variety of guitars and sample tracks. The video today is divided into 4 sections. First, I'll say a little bit about why you should care about this. Second, I'll explain how to prepare the guitar samples that you will then reamp during your speaker shootout. Third, I'll explain the reamping process and how to set that up carefully and correctly. And then finally, I'll talk about how to mic your amp and record from the speakers in a reproducible way. Okay, so real quick, why should you even care about this? Why do you need a process at all? Can't you just put a speaker in your amp, strum some chords, listen, switch out the speaker, do the same, etc.? There are plenty of YouTube videos that do just this process. Well, sure, you can do that, but it's actually pretty hard to remember what you heard, and there are also a lot of variables, such as how you play each time, how hard you play, how well you play. There's even a feedback loop of bias you need to consider, where if you feel like the speaker you're playing through sounds better, you might start playing better, and then you're exaggerating the differences between the speakers. Even if you're really careful to play the same way every time, and you record your clips and listen later, there are still things to consider in terms of consistency of the whole recording chain setup. So if you want to have an unbiased comparison, or if you just like geeking out on things like recording process, this video might be for you. So if you've decided you want to do this, the first thing you need to do is record the guitar tracks that you'd like to use. We're going to record these first and then reamp them, which I'll explain in a moment, so that we can hear the exact same musical piece played the exact same way through every speaker. Side note, you could also use this to do an amplifier shootout. Really, you can do it to shoot out anything, speakers, amps, pedals. The only thing you can't use it for is to shoot out guitars because, well, I hope you can see why that wouldn't work. So you want to plug your guitar either directly into a recording interface via an instrument input, or preferably into a mic input using a direct box, such as the Radiolab's J48, which is the one that I used. I actually discovered that there was no detectable difference between using the direct box versus plugging straight into the interface. This might suggest that my interface, which is the Motu M2, is pretty good, but it is generally considered a best practice to use a direct box. One important note here is that you want to record a completely dry signal. No amp or effects should be in the recording chain because you want to be able to send your guitar signal into these things later. Of course, it can be really hard to play parts with the correct feel without hearing the amp or effects tone, but there are a couple of solutions for that. Option number 1, you can add modeling amps or effects to your signal chain within your recording software and then disable these after recording. Option number 2 is to take advantage of the second output on a direct box like the J48 and send that into your amplifier purely for the purpose of monitoring while you're playing. You don't need to actually record that. Actually, if this were a studio session, you might record this as well as the direct signal so that you could have the choice of using the live amp tone or reamping later. Radiolabs has some good videos about this process. Either of these options are fine for monitoring your playing, but if your musical performance requires you to have guitar feedback, which happens when you're moving so much air with the speaker that it adds more vibration to your strings, then you should go with option number 2 to capture that important nuance. Last point during this recording of your raw guitar signal is that you have to make sure that your recording interface is not clipping. So watch the gain levels during the loudest part of the piece and stay out of the red. I found that for one of my guitars, a Les Paul with particularly high output pickups, I needed to engage the 15 dB pad on the J48 direct box to avoid clipping. Even with my interface set to 0 gain, there was still too much signal. That's just something to watch out for. Okay, so now you've got a bunch of tracks that you've recorded, and what we're going to do next is reamp them, which involves sending the signal back out through your recording software, out of the audio interface, and into your amp. The goal here is for the signal that the amp sees to be virtually identical to what the amp would have seen if you had plugged the guitar directly into the amplifier. To do this, we're going to use a reamping box such as the Radiolab's X-Amp. Radiolabs makes a few different models, and this one seemed to get great reviews and was recommended particularly for guitars with passive pickups, which is what I've got. You start by connecting a balanced line out, this can either be XLR or quarter-inch TRS, from your audio interface to the XLR input of your reamping box. Depending on your audio interface, you might need to jump through some hoops here. If your interface has more than 2 line outs, you're all set. Just make sure that you send your signal to be reamped via your recording software through one of these line outs that are distinct from the ones that go to your stereo out or monitoring output. If you only have 2 line outs, it's still possible to do this, but you need to do a few things. Because you're only using a single line out to go to the amp, you want to pan your track all the way to the side whose line out you plan to use so that you're not throwing away half the signal. And then, when you record, you need to make sure that the channels you're recording onto are muted, because if they're going out to the stereo output and they're not muted, then guess where they're going after that? Right into your guitar amplifier to be amplified again. This will cause a shockingly loud squeal and hopefully not destroy your amp, your microphone, or your ears. I guarantee it's a mistake you'll only make once, twice tops. Once you have the line out going into the reamp box, find the loudest section of the part that you recorded and play it on a loop while watching the input meter on your reamping box. Make sure it doesn't register any clipping. If it does, reduce the level of that channel in your recording software. It turns out that the clip light on the radial X amp seems to coincide almost exactly with 0 dB level in the recording software, which is nice. Once you've got things set up so there's no clipping, you then want to adjust the output gain of the reamping unit so that it exactly matches the signal level that comes from your guitar. This is very important because if you have too high or too low of a level here, then you're not giving the preamp in your amp the same signal as the guitar, and you'll definitely hear tonal differences. Every guitar has a different output level. It's a function of the guitar, the pickups, the location of the pickups, and the distance from the pickup to the strings. So even 2 strats with identical pickups could be different if they're not set up the same way. So how do you do this? Well, there are a few ways. The informal way is to plug your guitar into the amp, strum a bit, see how loud it is, then switch over to the reamp signal by plugging the output of the reamp box into the amplifier and adjust the gain so that it matches what you heard from the guitar directly. That's not very precise, but it will do. Another way to do this would be to use your recording mic already set up in front of your amplifier and watch the levels and try to get the levels to be about the same. That's a better way. A third way, which is actually the way that I used, partly because it can be done silently, but probably more so because I'm a geek, is to connect your guitar cable to a multimeter like the Fluke 87 and measure the AC RMS voltage while playing the same part as your recorded track. That meter can be set to record maximum RMS signal, then switch over to the output from the reamping box, attaching your multimeter to a quarter-inch jack coming out of the reamper, and then adjust the gain until the maximum RMS signal is the same as what you saw from your guitar. Although that seems a little excessive, I actually think it's kind of instructive to do this so that you understand what your instrument is putting out. Furthermore, it's a neat trick to use when setting up your guitar if you wanted to make sure your pickup heights are well balanced. Turns out that there's a big difference in output voltage between guitars, which is consistent with what we intuitively already know, but putting numbers on it can be useful. The maximum RMS voltages coming out of a Stratocaster, for example, are between 100 and 150 millivolts, Telecaster between 200 and 250, and a Les Paul, or presumably other humbucking guitars, is around 400 to 500 millivolts. My gold top Les Paul, which has Burstbucker Pro PAFs, was actually putting out between 650 and 700 millivolts the way I currently have it set up. I might need to take a look into that. Once you've matched the levels between your guitar and the output from the reamping box, then you connect the reamper via a short quarter-inch jack to your amplifier input and get your amplifier settings exactly the way you want for the tone that you're going to use for the speaker shootout. It's important to note, of course, that whichever speaker you do this with will have some impact on how the whole shootout goes, because the first speaker is the one you're going to get your amplifier settings with. If it's the brightest of the speakers and you ended up reducing the treble on your amp to compensate, then all of your other speakers may sound darker. Of course, that's part of what you're trying to measure. I might suggest using a speaker you know to be sort of in the middle in its tonal characteristics. Most importantly, once you've got your amp tones set, you don't want to change those dials on your amp at all as you cycle through the different speakers. It's best to write them all down too, so if you bump a knob, you know where you were at. So we created our raw guitar tracks, and now we've got them coming out of the amplifier with the tone we want. The last step is to record the tracks from each of the speakers you want to evaluate. For my speaker shootout, I used two microphones to record the amps. The first was an SM57 dynamic mic, which I placed just at the edge of the cone, about 1 inch from the grill of the cabinet, with the face of the mic perpendicular to the grill, on axis. The second was a ribbon mic, which was an inexpensive attempt at a clone of a Royer 121. This one is positioned in line with the center of the cone, and it's perpendicular to the SM57. The position of these two mics are aligned so that the center line of the ribbon mic, which is where the ribbon sits, is in the same plane as the front of the cartridge in the SM57. That actually results in the SM57 appearing to be a little closer to the grill cover because the cartridge is set back a little bit inside of the SM57. It's important to be pretty close with this to avoid any phase differences between your signals, although at these distances, a little bit of error probably isn't going to kill you. Little sidebar here about how phase differences come into play. We get complete cancellation of signal at a given frequency if two waves are offset by half of a wavelength, which is 180 degrees, or any odd multiples of that. For example, at 330 Hertz, which is the frequency of your high E string, the wavelength of sound at room temperature is almost 4 feet. So complete waveform cancellation would be if the mics were spaced apart by 2 feet, and partial cancellation would happen on either side of that. It's not actually that simple since you transition from cancellation to addition as your distance moves between half and full wavelengths, but for our purposes, we're trying to be as close to zero physical offset as possible so we can forget about the higher order multiples. Even if we consider the highest audible harmonics of guitar at the limits of human hearing, say 20 kilohertz, the wavelength is about 2/3 of an inch. So yes, if you can hear that well at 20 kilohertz, you better get those mics aligned perfectly. But if your error is definitely less than half an inch, I don't think any human will be able to tell you they hear cancellation. You can check this after recording as well by looking at the alignment of the two waveforms from the microphones when zoomed in on the tracks. If you're doing a close mic and a distant room mic, you'll definitely see a big shift, and you'll need to slide one of those tracks to align the transients. The more distant mic will have its waveform shifted to the right. Alright, back from my sidebar. So once you've got your microphone or microphones positioned, adjust your channel gains on the two audio interface inputs so that there's no clipping when playing your sample track through the amplifier, and record your track, which will be 2 tracks, one for each microphone. Once you've got your track, turn everything off, including the amplifier, and then swap speakers. This can be pretty straightforward or a big pain in the butt, depending on what type of cabinet you've got it in. With a small combo, you might need to remove tubes or even the chassis. When you've changed speakers, you'll need to make sure your microphones are once again positioned in the exact same location, since even small differences here of half an inch or so could change the tone. The best way to do this is to have really sturdy mic stands that you don't bump, and then to either have some type of tape marks for your cabinet on the floor relative to the microphones, or a placement marker on the grill cover to align things with. Then use a ruler to re-verify that your closer mic is at the same distance you had before. As far as recording goes, that's all there is to it. After recording each track, you have a couple of decisions you need to make about how you process and combine your signals. The first question has to do with absolute output normalization. It's a certainty that some of the speakers will be louder than others. Are you interested in reflecting that in your speaker comparisons? I would actually recommend against that because it will be harder to compare tone if you're hitting your monitors and then your ears with a different absolute level. What I recommend is normalizing all of your tracks to have the same loudness. An app like Logic Pro or Pro Tools, or really any of the apps, will let you normalize tracks using some type of non-destructive gain offset. You can either normalize the peaks, or what I did was to normalize the loudness, which is better for maintaining a consistent perceptual level. I used a level of -23 LUFS, or loudness units relative to full scale. You could go higher if you're only recording for one microphone, but if your plan is to combine the signal from 2 mics, that'll bring the overall loudness up a bit. If you're really interested to know how the speakers differed in real-world loudness, you could set your microphone input gains a little bit on the conservative side, staying away from clipping by several dB, and then start your shootout with your known loudest speaker, and then not adjust the microphone preamp gains at all during the shootout. Since you're normalizing anyways, this should be okay. And then the difference in normalization offset gains that was required to get each speaker and microphone to the -23 LUFS will give you a good indicator of the relative volume difference. That, of course, really depends on consistent microphone placement. However, if that were your goal, I would actually recommend a different approach and have one of your mics be a more distant room mic. The reason is that with close miking, your actual distance to the speaker is not really consistent between speakers, even if you position your mic at the same distance from the grill. And that's because the shape of each speaker is a little bit different, with some of them having steeper slope to their cones. So if you're 1 inch from the grill cover, you might be 4 inches from the cone of one speaker and 6 inches from the cone of another speaker. In any case, we're not looking to write a paper on how loud each speaker is. We're looking to compare their tones, so probably don't worry about this one. The other consideration you need to make when processing your clips is how much of each mic you want to include in your composite clip. Every mic has a different frequency response. The 57s, for example, do a good job of capturing tightness and brightness. The ribbon mic captures much more low end. So if we're doing this for the purpose of creating a production quality track, we'd probably choose that balance to taste to give us exactly what we want for the track. For the purpose of speaker comparisons, there's a little bit of a different goal, which is to get as much of a representation of the speaker's tone as possible. What I decided to do in my shootout was use an equal amount of the two loudness normalized tracks, with both mic signals panned to the center. It would actually be interesting to see how the speakers compared if I'd used a condenser mic placed at a distance of 3 to 4 feet instead of the ribbon mic, since that might have given us some sense of listening in a room versus a very studio-centric representation of the tone. Perhaps that's an experiment for another day. So that's it for this overview of how I used reamping to create consistent speaker shootout. Happy to hear your comments and questions and any suggestions you've got for how I can improve on this process. Thanks, and have a great day.